Welcome to College Algebra section P.5 review. We're also going to do P.6 review. And the first problem we're going to look at is multiply and simplify these two rational expressions, x squared minus 4x over 3x squared plus 6x times 2x squared plus 5x plus 2 over x squared minus 16. So your first step is factor all of the expressions, then cancel any factor matching a numerator and a denominator. Factor out cancel or cancel out factors. So pause the tape and try this one on your own. So when we factor this, we find this first fraction has greatest common factors that can be factored out, an x and also a 3x. And the second fraction, we have a trinomial that you either factor by grouping or possibilities. I think factoring by possibilities is far easier because there's only two possibilities and then a difference of squares. So then when we cancel common factors, we find an x minus 4 cancels and we have an x plus 2 cancels. And there's one more cancellation that you should not miss, and that's the factors of x. An x and an x cancels out. So that leaves 2x plus 1 in the numerator and 3 times x plus 4 in the denominator, and that's our answer. When we multiply all the factors together, that's our final answer, and you could leave it just like that, or you could multiply out the denominator. Either form would be fine. In our next review problem, we're going to subtract rational functions. When we subtract or add fractions, we need a common denominator. So you're going to have to adjust both these fractions and make them into fractions with a common denominator. Then you can combine them. So pause the tape and try this on your own, and then come back and we'll go through it. So your first step is find the least common denominator or identify it, and it has to be the product of the two denominators, x minus 2 times x plus 1. So you're going to multiply one fraction by x plus 1 over x plus 1 and one fraction by x minus 2 over x minus 2. So do that if you haven't done that correctly yet, and then finish this up. So we multiply the fractions to get the common denominator, and then it simplifies to this result at the bottom. X plus 1 over the common denominator minus x squared minus 3x plus 2 over the common denominator. So now you have to be careful. You're subtracting that whole trinomial from x plus 1. So really you're going to want to put parentheses around it when you subtract to get the correct result. So when we subtract, you get a negative x squared. When we subtract negative 3x, we're actually adding 3x to the x, so it's plus 4x. This is where people trip up. And then we're taking 1 minus 2 makes a minus 1. So that's our final answer there. Negative x squared plus 4x minus 1 over the common denominator, x minus 2, x plus 1. Okay, in our next problem, we want to simplify a complex fraction. Now, there's several ways. There's two different ways you can do this. But the way I like to show, because it's the most versatile way and it works for any complex fraction, is we want to combine these top two fractions into one fraction. And once you get a fraction divided by a fraction, we just invert and multiply by x minus 1 over x, the denominator fraction. So that's the strategy here. Combine these two, get a fraction, divide by a fraction. When you divide fractions, you just invert the fraction you're dividing by and then multiply. So give this a try and then come back and check here. So you combine these two numerator fractions by getting the common denominator, x times x minus 1, like we did in the previous problem. Combine those into one fraction. So when you combine those two and simplify, the top fraction simplifies to 3x minus 1 over x times x minus 1. The bottom fraction is still x over x minus 1. We haven't done anything with that yet. Now invert that bottom fraction and multiply. And when we invert and multiply, we find that the x minus 1 factors cancel each other. So the result is 3x minus 1 over x times x, or 3x minus 1 over x squared. And that's the final simplified answer. Okay, and I'm going to do one more review problem from P5. This is similar to number 10. It's really not the P5 section. It's a review problem. Multiply out square root of x minus 2x quantity squared. And I do this because a lot of students will make an error on this type of problem. When you're multiplying this out, you have to keep in mind that you're not just squaring both quantities. You're foiling out the quantity times itself. So that means first, outer, inner, and last. So square root of x times square root of x is x minus 2x square roots of x, the outside terms, minus another 2x square roots of x, the inside terms, and then it's going to be plus 4x squared, the last terms. And then you can simplify as x minus 4x square root of x plus 4x squared. Okay, moving on to a few P.6 problems, review problems. We start with writing 5 plus 2i minus 2 plus I in standard form, where I is the complex number I equals square root of negative 1. And that means I squared is negative 1. Now in the lecture, in the notes, I stressed that we treat I just like x, but whenever we get an I squared, we replace it with negative 1. That won't happen in this problem, but it will in a few problems we're going to do. And also, the standard form is a plus bi. So you have a real part plus the I part. So in this case, treating I like x, 5 minus 2 makes 3, and 2i minus an I makes just an I. That's it. Okay, next we're going to look at writing a complex fraction in standard form. Now normally a fraction you can divide it out. Well, you can't do that with these I terms. It just doesn't work. But we have a way of dividing that out, and that is to write or multiply by the complex conjugate of the denominator, which in this case is 4 minus 2i. 4 minus 2i. And when you do that, you have to keep in mind that you're going to FOIL out the numerator, FOIL out the denominator. The denominator will simplify to a real number. So complete this and write your answer in standard form, which is a plus bi. Don't write it as a fraction, but write it in that form. So when we FOIL it all out, we get 8 minus 4i minus another 4i plus 2i squared over 16 minus 8i plus 8i minus 4i squared. And first off, the 8i's cancel. And we see the occurrence of the 2i squared terms. Whenever you see an I squared, replace it with -1. So we're going to take each of those I squares and replace with -1. So I've done that. Also, I've combined the -4i into -8i, if you're wondering where that came from. So when you switch out the I squares with -1s, you get this result, 8 minus 8i plus 2 times -1 over 16 minus 4 times -1. And that simplifies to positive 6 minus 8i over 20. Now that's not a plus bi form. What you have to do is then split it up into two fractions. 6/20 minus 8/20 I, and those can then be reduced to 3/10 minus 2/5 I. And I think if you're doing this problem in WebAssign and you don't simplify the fractions, they might mark it wrong. I wouldn't mark it wrong if you got to this first result, because technically that would be a plus bi form. But if you just write this fraction, that's not a plus bi form. Okay, and I'm including one more problem. Although this isn't a P6 section problem, it's a review problem, and it's in the homework. It's number 7. It has that extra step where you're going to have to factor the denominators before you can figure out what the least common denominator. So factor those denominators, pause tape and factor those, and we'll come back. So the denominators factor as x plus 1, x minus 1, and the other one is 2 times x plus 1. So our least common denominator has to have a factor of 2, it has to have an x plus 1, and it has to have an x minus 1. So here the least common denominator is not just the product of the denominators, because we don't have to include the x plus 1 twice, just once. So there's your least common denominator. So now adjust both of those fractions so it has that denominator and combine results. And come back and check your answer. So we multiply the first fraction by 2 over 2 because it's missing the 2. We multiply the second fraction by x minus 1 over x minus 1. And now we can combine those two into one fraction, 2 minus 5 times quantity x minus 1. Now here you got to watch your signs when you combine terms. When we're multiplying out that 5 times x minus 1, we're actually getting a negative 5x plus 5. Because it's a negative 5 times negative 1 makes plus 5. So 5 added to 2 makes 7, not negative 3. So we have 7 minus 5x over 2 times x plus 1, x minus 1. And also, I want to mention, don't cancel those 2's. The 2 in the numerator is part of a sum or difference. You can never cancel a part of a sum or difference with a factor. So that's it for P6 review, and we'll see you in class.